Isaiah is privy in that moment to this heavenly liturgy
Uh-huh.
and is invited to participate in the heavenly liturgy. But his response is very much like the response you described when you hear that oracle and you feel accused and you feel convicted, right? Because he says, I am not worthy. I am a man of impure lips living among a people of impure lips. But the very seraphim that is praising God for God's holiness in that liturgy takes a coal from the altar and uses that coal to purify the mouth of the prophet, um, and says, "Your sins have been atoned." Right? There's so much there. Folks should be, if you're familiar with the Catholic Mass, you're connecting all kinds of dots in this moment, right?
Yeah.
But again, if we are invited through that first person call story to be present in that same liturgy, and then we
Mhm.
participate in that same liturgy Sunday after Sunday, right? And experience a similar kind of moment of atonement and purification through the liturgy of the Eucharist, right? You can see again and think about that pairing of liturgy of the Eucharist and liturgy of the Word. Again,
Uh-huh.
pairing of Word and body in the Mass itself. Like you just see all these pieces coming together.
Welcome to the Benedictine Thought and Action Podcast. We are beginners in the Benedictine way, so we need to listen to the voice of wisdom. Otherwise, we're sunk. Join John and Jason as they learn to become more aware of God through living hospitably in community. In today's interview podcast, Just John interviews his favorite Duke Divinity School professor, Anathea Portier-Young, about her recent book, The Prophetic Body, Embodiment and Mediation in Biblical Prophetic Literature. Dr. Portier-Young is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School. She specializes in biblical prophetic literature, early Jewish apocalyptic literature and novellas, and historiographic literature of the late Second Temple period. Her current research examines biblical prophecy through the lens of embodiment, including embodied cognition, religious experience, materiality, affect and emotion, and embodied reception. And if all that wasn't enough to let you know that you are about to witness John in his nerdiest form yet, then buckle up. Me and my voiceover friends in the ether were delighted to witness Thea's mastery. I almost would say it made me feel something real, something embodied.
How did you get into biblical studies, and what's it like getting to teach people that are going into ministry careers biblical studies?
Yeah. Okay. So I came to biblical studies by way of classics. I was a major in ancient Greek language and literature. I was also a Latin nerd in high school, and believe it or not, started studying Latin in second grade. So I did all the junior classical league, read all the ancient mythology, and by the time I was thinking about grad school, I really wanted to find a way to continue studying the ancient world and its literature, but I wanted to focus on something that would make a difference in people's lives. And so I found my way to biblical studies, and in biblical studies, when you do doctoral work, you specialize. Either you do Old Testament or New Testament, and for me, it was the richness of the Old Testament literature, so many different genres that I had never encountered before, poetry, um, incredible complexity, and just really no area of human life that did not intersect with this literature. So I found myself surprised and fascinated every day of my study, and that is still true today.
That's
And then,
awesome.
yeah, in terms of teaching, I will say, it's just about the most fun part of our job to be able to work with students who constantly surprise you. And it is particularly exciting for me to work with students who are in formation for ministry. Our students have their foot very much simultaneously, one foot in the academic world and one foot in what we could call the real world, whether that's with a focus on church ministry or work in the community, or perhaps they plan to go on for further academic work, but they are always bringing questions that have that practical focus. And for me, that just goes right to the heart of what we do. And in my teaching, I I prioritize equipping students to do the work of interpretation. I teach courses where I have to lecture, and I don't mind doing that, but what I love most is seeing what students can do, being in conversation with students and seeing the wonder and the excitement that emerges as students gain those skills to be biblical interpreters and to become a part of the scholarly conversation.
Yeah. My impression is that when I took biblical bodies, I think I audited it because it was going to be like my fifth or sixth class that I was sitting in on, how I can't get enough classes. And I think it was the first time after you changed it to biblical bodies from the previous form of the class, and that class was so cool. Casey was in there, other people were in there, and the back and forth, the conversations, the interdenominational energy, the it was just so collaborative, and people were firing on all cylinders, trying to figure out what was going on with Metatron. It was awesome. And I still show that book to people constantly, that basic biblical bodies with
Yeah.
the picture, all of the, like, my students are like, what do you mean the heart is, I'm like, just take a look at this chapter. um they don't even have to read the words, you can just look at it in the pictures. So
So many great full color plates. I love that
oh
book.
yeah. Yeah, and I'll never forget the Dead Sea Scrolls toilets. That was a wonderful piece of the book that we read from what was the archaeologist from UNC?
Joni Magnus.
Yes. I loved that book. Oh
Yeah.
man, I loved that book.
And if folks want to know, the other book is Sylvia Schroer and Thomas Staubli's
Yeah.
Body Symbolism in the Bible.
Uh, Absolutely. Okay. So previously you wrote a sort of it's been told to me by other people that it was a game changer in apocalyptic literature, and that it really helped people to understand the political dimensions of apocalyptic literature. And by the way, one thing that you really ingrained in me is to never just say apocalyptic. So I always am very careful. I'm like, no, no, it's an adjective. Apocalyptic what? So
I
um
appreciate the terminological precision.
so then I wonder, how did you get from sort of the political realities of the ancient world and how this strange apocalyptic literature functions in that place, all the way to prophetic literature and embodiment? It makes sense to me because I know you, but maybe that journey would be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah. So 15 years ago, I was writing. So people may not know, when faculty at universities or colleges come up for tenure or come up for promotion, you have to write an intellectual narrative. It's a very hard genre to write, and so you engage in this deep reflection about what's the center, what's the nucleus for all these diverse things that you've published and the kinds of questions you're asking in your scholarship. And when I was writing that narrative for my tenure review process 15 years ago, I described that driving question underlying all of my work as the relationship between word and body. And I kind of parsed that out a little bit, word and body, text and action, theory and praxis. And this was way before I envisioned this project or thought I would ever write a book about prophetic literature at all. Um,
You engaged in prophecy in that narrative.
yes, called it. So in that first book that you mentioned, Apocalypse Against Empire, Theologies of Resistance in Early Judaism, I was interested in how the text, whether we're talking about apocalypses as specific literary works, apocalypse as a genre, or the earlier literature, earlier biblical literature, especially that the apocalypses were reinterpreting. Okay, so
Mhm.
how the text could have effects in the world. In that case, as works of resistance that also inspired acts of resistance. And I was very interested in that project in the effects on real bodies historically, and also what was portrayed in that literature. But how a text could model and prescribe an ethic in the face of
Mhm.
violence, domination, and imperial regimes. So, in that earlier project, that was how that question about the relationship between text and action, word and body took shape. In this new book, right, the relationship between word and body is exactly still the focus, but I come at it with reference to a different genre or set of genres, but prophetic literature and with a focus on stories about prophets' religious experience and the ways they mediate religious experience, um, including encounter with God and relationship with God. But in many ways, I came to this specific project on embodiment in the biblical prophetic literature through my teaching. So, my first book was partly animated by a set of questions about violence and nonviolence. And that same set of questions led me to teach a class called Gender, Ethnicity, and Violence in the Old Testament. It was a very difficult class. After a semester of studying with my students these narratives of sexual violence and a surprising amount of dismemberment, I wanted to put the body back together. And so
Mhm.
then I started teaching a different class called Biblical Bodies, and we focused on every aspect of embodiment that I could think of. It was a very interdisciplinary class. And in many ways, the methodology of that seminar furnished the multidisciplinary approach of the prophetic body, as well as the kind of integrative model of the person that really drives the prophetic body. I had also for many years taught a range of seminars on biblical prophets and not just at Duke. I taught a class at Notre Dame. I taught a class at Sewanee. So being able to interact with students in different learning communities around the prophets and this project took shape at the meeting point of those interests.
Yeah, that all makes total sense to me, and you saying that, word and body is all part of it, now it's maybe this too is a game changer because I think it seems really clear to me that one way to look at this book that you've written, The Prophetic Body, is that you're offering a really important corrective, whereas at least in biblical scholarship, but I'd argue probably in the life of the church as well, prophecy's been seen as largely a textual affair, and that throughout the course of your book, you highlight how it not only is just as important that they're embodied, but in some ways it has the same variety of purposes, the same interesting like wealth of mediation, as you say. So I wonder if maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that logocentric view and how why it was important to you to bring embodiment to the table.
Yeah. So you use the word logocentric, which I use in the book, to talk about the dominant way in modern biblical scholarship that scholars have talked about biblical prophetic literature, and also about the role of the prophet. So when we look at definitions of what is a prophet, what is prophecy, usually what we find are definitions that focus on um, prophet as mouthpiece for God or for any deity, spokesperson. We also see references to a prophecy as a message, right? If we define prophecy as a message, it would be a message sent from the deity to to a human recipient or group through the person of the prophet. And what I found when I dug into prophetic literature more deeply is that words are super important. I don't want to minimize. Words are so important, right? We read prophetic books. We
Uh-huh.
have the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel, the book of the 12, right? Um, and we have all of these places where you read in the prophetic literature, thus says the Lord, word of the Lord. There's no denying the importance of the word. And I don't mean to devalue that um, deny that. But when you dig into these narratives and these prophetic books, you also see a host of other other kinds of stories. For example, stories of prophets engaged in acts of healing as a form of prophecy, feeding others, sometimes not an act of prophecy in itself, but we have stories about what's happening to the prophet in very embodied ways. So prophets eating and sleeping, but not just any eating and sleeping, being fed by angels or sleeping in the sanctuary in order to receive a communication from God, right? These kinds of stories focalize the body. And so my question then was have we arrived at a kind of truncated picture of what prophecy is? When we start to look at prophetic narratives more closely, we see that that word is conjoined to the body, that they operate in synergy, that the prophetic body is just as important to the work of prophetic mediation. And just as I mentioned with that class on biblical bodies, if we look at that through a multidisciplinary set of lenses, kind of do this 360-degree analysis of what we see, um, we begin to appreciate all of this these diverse ways that the prophetic body isn't just there to illustrate the prophetic message. It's not an awkward appendage to the prophetic message. It's it's a crucial part of what prophecy is, and it's a crucial part of how prophets mediate. It's part of what prophets mediate, and that makes sense too when you think about the relationship between God and people. God is interested in the embodied life of human beings, so much so that in the incarnation, God became a human being to experience the embodied life of human beings, to become one of us. Um, that embodied life is at the heart of our relationship with God. So it makes a lot of sense that what prophecy is should also engage and entail the body in important ways.
Absolutely. When I used to talk about this to other people, in one way or another, or if I was trying to explain it to students, perhaps, I used to say that logocentric view was sort of the mouth of Sauron view of prophecy. That the body was sort of incidental. But the more I think about Lord of the Rings and the more I've read your book, the more I think perhaps no one's prophetic body has been more shaped by their experience of divinity than the mouth of Sauron, right? Because they're just left as a disfigured and all of these things that we also see in biblical texts. So I don't know. I'm just fascinated by all of these things that you're pointing out, and I think maybe maybe the point for me and maybe the point for some of the listeners too is maybe my view of embodiment is too limited. Is that is that something that you've come across, or is that people are really excited to hear about all these varieties of embodiment that you're bringing up?
Yeah, let's go to that statement. Maybe my view of the body is too limited. Um, I invite folks listening to think about all the ways we are coached to sort of detach from what we experience in our bodies. And when we think of our core self, uh, often we sort of separate that out from our bodily experience, um, our bodily practices. We are also coached to um, divvy up our person so that reason is over here and emotion is over here and bodily functions are over there. Um, but the reality is they're all bound up together. And I mean, I can only really answer for myself to say that the more I dug into studying embodiment and embodied cognition, bodily experience, affect and emotion, um, mobility, just all these kinds of topics that I honestly hadn't been thinking about all of those topics when this project started. Um, but the more you dig in, the more you realize, oh, this this domain of life with which I am quite familiar, and which I may have a range of feelings about, involves my body, and for others, it involves their bodies, and the ways that we exist as a community and exist in relationship, that involves our bodies, right? And the more we can notice that and become attuned to that and choose to regard the body as a site of sacred connection rather than simply a site of disaster or unpleasant functions or
Embarrassment, you know.
right.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
body is how we are in relationship, and that includes how we are in relationship to God. So
Absolutely. That makes total sense to me, and I'm just so glad that you've written about it because it just it enlightens my it helps me to approach prophetic literature differently. Um, well, with that in mind, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how you define prophecy differently. The it seems like everyone, when they approach literature, they've got to come up with their definition, and you've come up with a definition of your own, which I think's a wonderful contribution. So, could you talk us through your definition? I can find it if we need it for
I
reference.
can't, yeah. I mean, my definition is a big bucket. In effect, because first I'll frame it for a second, because
Yeah.
I was interested in what we're talking about in the modern period, right? When we talk about prophets as scholars or in the popular imagination that is often resulting from a kind of translated form of what scholars have been saying, what we're saying in our churches, right? So I was interested in when we look at um, how people in the modern period talk about biblical prophecy and who they identify as prophets. Okay. Um, and if we look at the biblical texts, we find there's not just one word in Hebrew that labels a prophet by that in that sense of people who modern interpreters and much of the tradition prior to the modern period would call a prophet. The main term is navi. That is certainly the most frequent term, but we also see the phrase ish Elohim, which is translated man of God. We see two words that mean seer, Jose and Roeh, both mean seer, someone who sees. And and all of those terms get over time kind of bundled into this aggregate role of prophet. I want to be clear that when we look at biblical stories about prophets and we look at biblical prophetic texts, we see different kinds of prophets. So, in generating a big bucket definition, which I'll come to in just a moment, of prophecy, it is not to say that every prophet engages in exactly all the same types of activity. Some of our prophets are miracle workers. Not all of our prophets. Some of our prophets are healers. Not all of our prophets. Some of our prophets are 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 only speakers of or writers of words, let's say, as far as we know. Some of our prophets are performing dramatic symbolic actions like street theater, but not all of them. Okay, so there's a range. But the definition that I use for my book is the mediating activity performed by prophets. The forms of mediation, whatever they may be, performed by figures and personae in the biblical literature who are referred to as prophets.
Uh-huh.
Um, that kind of expansive definition, it's not a narrow definition by any means, but the contours of that are in effect defined by tradition. And so we can recognize that there's what I would call a kind of phenomenological diversity in portrayed in the texts and likely in the world behind the text. But we're studying those texts thousands of years later.
Yeah, it seems to me that so many of these definitions, and it's probably because I'm your student and Ellen's student, and but they seemed so obsessed with keeping things out of the definition. Like this isn't prophecy, so that I can say what it is. And I'm so appreciative for your definition because it allows us an opportunity to think that people participated at different degrees and in different ways, and we can look at the wealth of the diversity in the prophetic literature and what must have been kind of a messy prophetic experience for both for the prophet and the people. um, yeah, which brings me. Speaking of messy prophets, um, I wonder if we might talk about the two stories that you frame your whole book with, because I don't think it's controversial for me to say that these probably wouldn't leap out to most people as the stories about prophets, but they so beautifully illustrate what you're saying about word and body. And those are first and anyway, I've got so many follow-up questions, but yeah, what brought you to those two narratives, one in First Kings 13 and the other in I think Second Kings 13,
Yeah,
isn't it?
makes it easy to
Yeah.
to remember. Okay, so first first of all, if people aren't familiar with these stories, they're really delightful, delightfully odd, and the first one in First Kings 13 is kind of a puzzle. And for a handful of years, I used that passage in First Kings 13 with my students in introduction to Old Testament interpretation when in our unit about what is prophecy, and and it proved to be a really rich text to have students discuss and really dig into. Some have said so this story about a man of God and an old prophet, um, they aren't named, and some have said, well, perhaps it's a parable about prophecy, and I found that reading to be fairly persuasive. It has a kind of almost a legendary character, right? For this study, also, uh, it happened to be the passage with the high it I as far as I can tell, in the Old Testament, with the highest density of references to the Word of God and references to the body. And with that body, different terms, not always the same word used throughout, but one word commonly used to describe flesh, one word commonly used to describe corpses, in fact, but nevertheless, body. Um, and so it was that density of reference that raised the set of questions for me. Okay, how does this passage portray the relationship between word and body? Um, the passage in 2 Kings 13, it's such a short passage. It describes the it describes a scenario in which Elijah Elisha has died, and he's, we're at the site of his grave, but there's a group of grave diggers who are digging a grave for someone else who has died, and a group of bandits comes upon them, and they need to flee in a hurry, and so they just sort of throw this body of the recently deceased man into Elisha's grave, and they run away. And the moment this recently deceased body comes into contact with the bones of Elisha, the man stands up. He's alive again. Um, I was intrigued by this passage in part because in the book of Sirach, um, so folks may know that the book of Sirach is widely considered to have in it maybe our first evidence for something like a prophetic canon. That somewhere around the year 200 BCE, we have in the book of Sirach references to our major prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. And in that same part of Sirach is a reference to the bones of the prophets that give life to Israel from where they are buried. That struck me as an indicator, perhaps, that the story in 2 Kings 13, as well as the story in 1 Kings 13, where once one prophet has died, I think the Ish Elohim has died, the prophet says, I want to be buried with my bones touching his bones. There was something critical across these stories in relation to the bones of the prophet, and bones in the metaphors that we find in the Hebrew Bible are often associated with strength and things that endure. And so this reference in Sirach suggested to me that there was already at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, or that turn of the century, um, reflection on the bodies of prophets uh, that connected these narratives to the life-giving role of prophets, not just in a moment when someone may come into contact with their bones, but their ministries. That's part of what Sirach is saying, right? In life, they were able to intervene for the salvation of Israel, and
Uh-huh.
in death, may they continue to do so, right? So it was that sort of triangle of references that led me to those stories as, in effect, bookends for the study. I think all of the arguments contained in the book could be made without those stories, and so when people do say, "Those are kind of odd stories," they really they really aren't.
No, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I just think they're
They're
beautiful,
but
beautiful illustrations of the point that you're making, and that they exist at all, I think, is evidence for your case, um, in my judgment. But
Exodus 3. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him as fire flaming out of a bush. When he looked, although the bush was on fire, it was not being consumed. So Moses decided, I must turn aside to look at this remarkable sight. Why does the bush not burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses, he answered, Here I am. God said, Do not come near. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father, he continued, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. But the Lord said, I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry against their taskmasters, so I know well what they are suffering. Therefore I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them up from that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now indeed, the outcry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen how the Egyptians are oppressing them. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God answered, I will be with you, and this will be your sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God at this mountain. But, said Moses to God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What do I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Then he added, This is what you will tell the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Quoted from the New American Bible, Revised Edition.
I um in reading, I was reading Balaam right before this, the Balaam chapters and Numbers, and I earlier today I read both of those, the First Kings and the Second Kings passages, and I think they also really demonstrate what you're saying about the need for a broader definition of prophecy, because they're both all three of those passages are frustratingly evasive about who's a prophet, what's a prophet called, when do they get the title. I don't think Balaam is ever named prophet until he prophetically calls the text itself prophecy. Then there's a man of God and a prophet, and that's the only distinction between the two. But then they seem to be doing the same sorts of things and having the same sorts of um, prophetic words and prophetic actions, and the spirit possession piece of it as well. It's just very interesting to me, and so I'm happy for your mediation definition. But if we were to talk about what people would very first think of as prophets, what to study if you'd like to know what a prophet is, they might bring up the call narratives. And so you very wonderfully in a single chapter, or I can't remember if it's more than one chapter, but you go through Moses as sort of a prototypical prophet and the first person narratives of the major prophets. Could you talk to us a little bit about the major themes there, and what was brought up to you in doing the study this way for the first time, maybe?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So Moses is often, you use the word prototypical. He's often considered a sort of paradigmatic prophet. Deuteronomy 18 refers to a future prophet like Moses. And one of the things that is often observed in the study of biblical prophetic call narratives is that the call of Moses in Exodus 3 and 4 seems to function as something of a template for later in the canon, call narratives, such as those we find in Isaiah 6, Jeremiah 1, and Ezekiel 2 to 3. And so there's also an important difference between those call narratives, and you alluded to that. So the call of Moses is told in third person. Um, we read a story about Moses, not told a- as it's narrated, not told by Moses, and And that third person narrative, I think in a lot of ways has the effect of highlighting the distinctiveness of Moses' experience, right? He is that paradigmatic prophet, and no one, though others may follow in that pattern, he is the prototype. But the other three are first person call narratives. And one of the things that I came to focus on in my research, and then in what I wrote about, was trying to understand what difference that made to read a call narrative in the first person. And for folks less familiar with the genre of call narrative, it's sort of exactly what it sounds like. They're also called commissioning stories, but it's that moment of encounter between God and the prophet when God calls the prophet to serve in this, or calls an individual to serve in this role as prophet, and typically gives them a particular commission, a particular job to do. And so we could say that those call narratives have a programmatic function, and this goes to, John, your question about themes in those call
Uh-huh.
narratives.
Uh-huh.
So, if you may have noticed when I was giving, chapters, right, they tend to occur early in a biblical book, and they introduce some of the major themes that will characterize that prophet's ministry. So in the case of Moses, the first thing that I noticed was the prevalence of certain body parts in his call narrative, a focus on Moses' mouth and Moses' hands. Uh, and the hand of Moses seemed to be tied to forms of action, and included his interaction with the staff that would transform, um, and was tied to his mission of liberating the Israelites from enslavement in Egypt, and had a parallel in references to the hand of God, the mighty hand by which God saves. The hand was a metonym for power. And so one of the things I saw was that the prophet's hand, in this case Moses' hand, was a kind of conduit for divine power, divine saving power, divine transformative power. But just as often as we read about Moses' hand, we also read about Moses' mouth. One of Moses' objections to his call is to say that he is heavy of tongue and sort of fumbles when he speaks. Right, his mouth is not agile, and I and others read that as describing Moses as likely a person with disability. I think that's also really important for us as readers of prophetic narratives to understand that prophets um, prophets uh, weren't called one on the basis of specific qualifications, but also to see the range of different kinds of physical characteristics and abilities that prophets bring to that role. Um, and the mouth was in that story very much associated with that work of speaking. So like this story in First Kings 13, I saw in that call narrative of Moses, um, that synergy of word and body playing out through these prophetic body parts and the metonyms of mouth and hand. The other thing to say is that it's not just Moses' body that's foregrounded in Moses' call narrative, but also, um, and this may be a little controversial to say, but the divine body. So I already
Yeah.
mentioned God's hand. Um, at the beginning of that story, God says, "I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cry, and I have come down." It it has now been, I would say, become a commonplace in biblical scholarship to note that the Old Testament narratives and prophetic literature portray some kind of bodily reality in their portrayals of God. Um, what that means differs across different kinds of texts. in this case, we aren't talking about God in human shape in this narrative, but to say that God interacts with us through senses of sight and sound, to say that God comes down, moving from one place to another place, um, those those fall under the broad umbrella of embodiment. And we can add whatever that means when we're talking about God. But this narrative portrays some kind of divine embodiment. Now, it also resists our over determining what that means, right? God appears in the flame of the burning bush that is burning and is not consumed, and it's showing us the transcendence of God. It's showing us the otherness of God, and that whatever this manifestation of God is, it does not conform to what we think of as quote unquote the laws of nature, right? It's going to defy our categories of understanding, our categories for organizing reality. So whatever we think is constitutive of this divine body in this sense is going to sort of break our categories.
Yeah.
So let me be clear about that.
Yeah.
But the idea that the prophet has this kind of bodily encounter with God as a way to prepare the prophet to mediate between this transcendent but present God and the people. And so, what the prophet experiences in the prophet's body is going to participate both in the divine reality and it's going to prepare and prefigure a human reality. So, I think those were the main things that I saw in Moses' story. And I know I've been
Uh-huh.
going on for a little while,
Go
but
on for as long as you want. I'm loving it.
so we could say some different things about those first person narratives that we find in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. To me, one of the most interesting things I mentioned before that I did some research into what difference does it make between third person narrative and first person narrative. And my research brought me to some really interesting studies in the field of embodied cognition, where they found that our bodies respond differently to third person narratives and first person narratives. When we hear or read a first person narrative, um, different parts of our sensory motor cortex are activated. There are measurable differences in the heat of our skin,
Uh,
right? There are measurable bodily responses that indicate higher levels of engagement and a kind of identification with the protagonist, with that speaking I, right? Our body, our mind and body together as one, we imagine ourselves experiencing what that first person speaker is experiencing. We imagine ourselves doing those actions. And parts of our brain are lighting up. It's happening in our bodies, right? A kind of action readiness occurs in our body, and an action simulation is occurring internally. Um, and when we look also at studies of literature, not necessarily with the electrodes attached or the fMRI, but writers, theorizers in the field of literature talk about experiences of immersion, transportation, and identification. And they have noted that first person narrative facilitates a higher degree of, again, that identification with the protagonist,
uh,
but also that feeling of being transported into the story world, that feeling of becoming immersed. Have you ever read a novel and it's so gripping, and the world is going on around you, and you notice none of it because you are in that world, right? That's what we mean by immersion. These first person prophetic call narratives. Isaiah, for example, Isaiah 6 is so sensory rich. It gives us all of these details: sight, sound, smell, um, vibration, movement, right? All of these sensory details that invite the reader to be present in the vision. They invite the reader to be present in that moment of encounter. And I argue they facilitate a kind of encounter. And when we're talking about a prophetic commissioning, then you realize the next step. If the reader is invited to identify with the prophet who is saying, "I saw this vision, I smelled this smell, I heard these voices, I met God before the throne, and then God said, 'Who will go?' And I said, 'I will go.'" Right? The person who identifies with the prophet is invited also to respond with the prophet, to receive that commission. So then we think about that action readiness in a really different way. It's not just for the sake of our imagination, but for the sake of what we will do with our lives, for the sake of how we will enact that commission too.
From Isaiah 6. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, with the train of his garment filling the temple. Seraphim were stationed above. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they hovered. One cried out to the other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. All the earth is filled with his glory." At the sound of that cry, the frame of the door shook, and the house was filled with smoke. Then I said, "Woe is me, I am doomed, for I am a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphim flew to me, holding an ember which he had taken with tongs from the altar. He touched my mouth with it. "See," he said, "now that this has touched your lips, your wickedness is removed, your sin purged." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" "Here I am," I said, "send me." Quoted from the New American Bible, Revised Edition.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially considering that in liturgical contexts, we're often hearing um, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah in the midst of a prophetic oracle. And in those cases, I'm often feeling accused by the text. Um, and that's probably subjective, but I think it's really interesting to think that the book starts out inviting you into that divine encounter,
And
rather than what my overwhelming experience has been, which is to feel like, oh no, I've done it wrong, you know?
John, because you mentioned liturgy, and we were just talking about Isaiah 6, folks may not realize in the Catholic Mass when, when we sing the Holy, Holy, Holy,
Mhm,
right? That's from Isaiah 6. So in that scene where the prophet Isaiah sees God seated on the throne in the temple, it's the seraphim
mhm,
that are singing, "Holy, holy, holy." Isaiah is privy in that moment, pardon me. Isaiah is privy in that moment to this heavenly liturgy
mhm.
and is invited to participate in the heavenly liturgy. But his response is very much like the response you described when you hear that oracle and you feel accused and you feel convicted, right? Because he says, "I am not worthy. I am a man of impure lips living among a people of impure lips." But the very seraphim that is praising God for God's holiness in that liturgy takes a coal from the altar and uses that coal to purify the mouth of the prophet, um, and says, "Your sins have been atoned." Right? There's so much there. Folks should be, if you're familiar with the Catholic Mass, you're connecting all kinds of dots in this moment, right?
Yeah.
But again, if we are invited through that first person call story to be present in that same liturgy, and then we
Mhm.
participate in that same liturgy Sunday after Sunday, right? And experience a similar kind of moment of atonement and purification through the liturgy of the Eucharist, right? You can see again, and think about that pairing of liturgy of the Eucharist and liturgy of the Word. Again,
Uh-huh.
pairing of Word and body in the Mass itself. Like you just see all these pieces coming together.
Yeah, so, um, in fact, I was recognizing it, I just didn't make the connection. That's wonderful, thank you.
From Exodus 34. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." So Moses was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, without eating any food or drinking any water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words. As Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hands, he did not know that the skin of his face had become radiant while he spoke with the Lord. When Aaron then and the other Israelites saw Moses and noticed how radiant the skin of his face had become, they were afraid to come near him. Only after Moses called to them did Aaron and all the leaders of the community come back to him. Moses then spoke to them. Later, all the Israelites came up to him, and he enjoined on them all that the Lord had told him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses entered the presence of the Lord to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out again. On coming out, he would tell the Israelites all that he had been commanded. Then the Israelites would see that the skin of Moses' face was radiant. So he would again put the veil over his face until he went and speak with the Lord. Quoted from the New American Bible, Revised Edition.
Um, I don't mean to because I honestly I feel like the last 2 sections of the book are just end to end so rich. But I do want to leave something on the table so that people will go and find your book in the nearest library or but I was just so struck in the transformations part. So you spend one section talking about the way that prophecy makes it so your definition makes it so exciting because I don't want to say the prophetic act or I don't want to say in in engaging as a prophet or with prophecy that the prophet's body is transformed in a great number of ways. But what was so exciting to me was that you solved the perceived problem of the horned versus the veiled or the glowing Moses by saying either way it's a beautiful representation of the argument that you're making. Could you talk to us a little bit about maybe people don't know why there are horned Moseses around? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
You want that specific passage?
Yeah, the way that you
Yeah. So
we've got the word, what is it? Quran, that means something
yeah,
like that.
yeah. Okay, so folks have probably seen sculptures of Moses, right? For example, in I think in St. Peter's, maybe there's a
Yeah.
sculpture of Moses, right, with little horns. And if folks are familiar with the paintings of Marc Chagall, right, you'll see both little horns and light coming from Moses' face, and both of those details derive from the same word in Hebrew. So in Exodus, shoot, I'm gonna I'm gonna get the chapter and verse wrong. I want to say 34,
I'll look it up.
somewhere around there. Um, so Moses has been on the mountain with God, and when he descends from the mountain, we're told that his face is it's Karan. Okay, whatever this means in Hebrew. Um, and it can mean Horned, it can mean maybe shining. We see in the interpretive tradition, in the ancient interpretive tradition, different translations that construed it in different ways. Um, both, like both, or cornuta, horned, or radiant, right? And so in chapter 5 of the Prophetic Body, where I talk about this passage, um, one of the lenses I use is monster theory. So monster theory is a really interesting development within literary studies that looks at you know literature about monsters, movies about monsters. Why do so many cultures love their monster stories? What cultural work are monster stories doing? And one of the things that um, theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who's one of the better known figures in that space, has said is that the monster sort of polices boundaries and inhabits the borders of the possible and the impossible, right? Um, and and we see this in biblical literature with figures like the cherubim or cherubim, the seraphim, who are flaming serpents, if you did not know that. Those folks singing "Holy, Holy." The cherubim, we have, like, Christmas cards that portray them as happy, chubby babies, but in reality, they were ferocious winged, beasts with characteristics of lions and, sort of fantastic composite creatures. Um, and those semi-divine beings, those angelic beings, exactly sort of police that boundary. They inhabited that edge between the divine and human realm. And what I found in the story of Moses is that something very similar happens with Moses. As he goes back and forth between the human realm and the divine realm, and spends that concentrated time with God when he receives the law on the mountain, he is physically transformed in a way that may be uh, reflecting some of the divine light, the way the moon reflects the sun's light, right? And makes that visible in the human realm. Or he may be turned into something that to some degree resembles a bull, this animal that was known in the biblical world to symbolize virility and strength, and was often associated with this particular deity, El. Um, and whichever it is, one of the things we read in his story is that when people see him, they are afraid of him. They run away from him. He has to cover his face in order for people to be willing to be near him. And so I was was very interested to think about how this transformation of Moses' body, yes, it elevated in him in some way, made him more like God, caused him to embody divine glory in a certain way, but it also isolated him. It had a cost to him. And that's something that we see across the prophetic stories. And I think if we think about our embodied life, if we think about our life more holistically, we can see that any work that we do, it costs us, right? There's always a kind of tax on our bodies. Um, and that was no less true for the prophets. Um, to be in that position, to mediate between the divine realm and the human realm, was dangerous. It was costly. It required prophets to sometimes push their bodies to extremes, to be willing to undergo in their bodies, uh, you know, the future that the people would experience, that was not always a pleasant future. So the prophet was not just someone who was blessed to propound God's word to the people, but someone who was willing to undergo in their bodies the cost.
Somebody whose body, not only their lives, but their body was marked by that mediation, um, which makes me think a little bit. We're a Benedictine university. It makes me think so often. I'm a Bergman fan, and I know that Walter Bergman, who's a wonderful Old Testament scholar and a lovely man. Um, he talks so beautifully about prophecy as being, sort of speaking truth to power. But your work makes me wonder if it's not important for us to also say those whose bodies have been transformed by that mediation, that encounter with God. And that makes me think further about your chapter about ascesis and those practices that transform the body. And as a Benedictine university, I wonder if that has something to say about our monastic traditions and Christianity, whether they ought to look to the prophets as inspiration or even to view their own work as prophecy.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that question. Right, Christianity knows a long tradition of ascetic practice. The Benedictine rule um, really beautifully instantiates that in community, which I think is such an important dimension of that. So when we think about ascetic practice, this idea of disciplining the body, disciplining the habits and desires of the body, um, a lot of scholarship on asceticism or ascesis, ascetic practice, will talk about decentering the self as a kind of it's a kind of denial of the body, a denial of the self, maybe an escape from the world. In my research for this project, I got to read some of Benedictine Dale Launderville's work on
Mm.
asceticism, and one of the things I found there was such a beautiful reflection, uh, undoubtedly growing out of his experience, living the Benedictine rule in community, um, but was to say that that ascetic practice need not be a denial, it can also be an embrace. It can contribute in a positive way to the transformation of the world. I found, Dale Launderville's work, which he doesn't frame it this way, but I thought of it as a kind of testimony emerging out of the shape of his life in the Benedictine tradition. I found that incredibly helpful for helping me to understand what might be happening in the case of Moses, for example, going up to the mountain and fasting and abstaining from water for 40 days during that time that he was with God on the mountain and receiving the law. That we can think about that ascetic practice in that case as in order to be worthy to spend that time with God, or in order to kind of cross over that barrier between the human realm and the divine realm, and to receive this revelation. But it's for a purpose. It's for the future of the people. It's for the life of the people and their relationship with God. It's to provide this supportive framework for their life with God and to transform the world through their faithfulness,
Mhm.
right? So in many ways, my own thinking about that ascetic practice um, in those stories in particular, of Moses' practice was shaped by, this scholarship coming out of the world of Benedictine community. And so when we flip that then and think about what is prophetic about, life in a monastic community? What is prophetic about disciplining ourselves um, in order to uh, both be closer to God, but also intercede for others and also be active in the world? I think there has often been a kind of false dichotomy between the contemplative life and the active life, right? And when I look at my colleagues who are Benedictines, um, I see that beautiful blend of the contemplative and the active, and I think that once again brings us back to that relationship between, um, you know, um, like theory. What is theory if not contemplation, right? Theory
Yeah.
and practice, um, and uh, and the prophetic dimension of that is when it is mediating God's love to others, mediating, um, understanding of God to others, mediating, the nurture. I mean, the Benedictine charism of hospitality, of course, is very much focused on the needs of the body. So I mentioned before prophets that are healing others and feeding others, right? That those are prophetic actions because God desires the wholeness, the wellness, the bodily well-being of humans and others in the world, right?
Yes.
So all those ways I see
Oh,
that practice as
say
prophetic.
that again.
From Matthew 17. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and do not be afraid. And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. Quoted from the New American Bible, Revised Edition.
Because for how many hundreds and thousands of years have we gotten that exactly wrong? God desires our embodied wellness.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
it's not always been seen that way. Uh, okay, well, I want to respect your time, so I'm going to leave the wonderful last section, which just had so much to offer in terms of I loved the mobility immobility chapter, and especially thinking about stability, but also just it
Mm.
was really cool. It was cool. And the Jonah piece, the inner affectivity, I could think about that for years. But I'll set that aside to respect your time and just maybe cap our conversation of your book with you know as I was reading your book and teaching synoptic gospels at the same time, I couldn't help but think, oh my gosh, perhaps the greatest evidence of all of these things, and not only that they are true generally, but that even people then were convinced that this was part of the role of the prophet or of prophecy, is the figure of Jesus in the Gospels. There is no doubt in anyone's mind about the importance of incarnation, um, of touch, of the way that Jesus's own body was transformed by this incarnation. So what do you think's appropriate about bringing Jesus into this conversation? What's a little blurry? What's exciting, and what's a little scary?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, first off, John's Gospel, prologue. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God, Word, I'm getting it wrong. Okay, but in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh,
Yeah.
right? That marriage of Word and body, that's the whole point
Yeah.
of John's prologue, and that's the incarnation, that's the person of Jesus. Um, In addition, when we look at the synoptic gospels and we look at Jesus's miracles of feeding people, folks may not realize, but the stories of multiplication of food have a precedent in the prophets Elijah and Elisha. So going back to First and Second Kings, feeding people miraculously, multiplying food so that there is enough and leftover, and um, making sure that there's provision for all. That's a classically prophetic action, and the same is true of healing.
Yeah, that's by the way, that has gotten to a point in my synoptic class where when I ask my undergrads, and what does that remind us of? Even if they don't know, they just sort of say, prophecy, prophets, is it prophets?
Yeah, so same with the man who was born blind,
Yeah.
right? Jesus heals his vision, and they say, "Well, okay, he healed you. Who do you say that he is? What do you say that he is?" And he says, "Well, he healed me. He's a prophet." Duh, right? So so saying that Jesus's actions are prophetic, saying that Jesus is a prophet doesn't exclude all the other things that Jesus is, Messiah, Son of God, right? But but it's also an integral part of who Jesus is, what Jesus does, right? So what we see in the Gospels is that in the person of Jesus, these roles are unfolded together, right? Jesus is also king. Jesus is, if we go to the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus is high priest, right? To be any one of those roles in the person of Jesus doesn't exclude the others. These are all different modes of mediation that are enfolded together in the person of Jesus, and Jesus is the epitome in these
Mhm.
portrayals of each, and also redefines each one in surprising ways, right? He is the priest who is also the sacrifice. He is the king who is crucified on a cross. Um, he is the prophet who is also God.
Yeah.
who
And
is
the prophet who goes up the mountain to take his place with Moses and Elijah and comes back down glowing.
Yeah.
Maybe minus the horns, but
Yes.
if
So,
only Jesus also had horns.
what one of the things that we can be thinking about is to sort of reverse the flow for a second, and say that the incarnation then it's I mean, it's absolutely a game-changing moment, right? It's it's like, it it it's it yeah, it changes everything. And at the same time, there's some continuity,
Yeah.
right? God has been incarnating God's care and God's desire for relationship in a host of ways over centuries prior to that moment, right? And the prophets are one part of that story.
Yeah. I see in all of those combined roles that you talk about a broad desire in God for this incarnation to be comprehensible. That there are so many handles to grab onto to understand the importance of this moment, the importance of this person, and the importance of that act.
God is
Um,
pulling out all the stops.
yeah.
Interestingly, one of the themes in the prophetic literature is that God sends prophets and people kill prophets. And that pattern actually doesn't change
Yep.
in, in the lifetime of Jesus. And so another piece that Jesus shares with the prophets is that taking the cost upon himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, this one's kind of a Hail Mary, but I also couldn't stop thinking, and you're a classics person. So I kept thinking about Tiresias, blind Tiresias and his blindness. And we talked a little bit about disability and prophets, and it seems like there's some slippage to me between if God is willing to or prefers people who experience disabilities for these roles, or if in some cases it seems like they are marked by their prophetic role in a way that some might describe as disability. And then I think of Tiresias, his disability to my eye seems sort of um like an irony, right? Like he's blind because he can to demonstrate to you how well he can see. um and which brings us sort of back to like monster theory, right? He's sort of a grotesque to show you that, oh no, I'm the one with the true sight. What connections do you see here, or do you see more differences than connections between this and Greco-Roman prophecy?
Yeah, I love that parallel. I think in both we see the prophet as what we would call a liminal figure, someone who occupies a threshold, someone who occupies margins, and you know, that can mean a lot of different things. Not every prophet, either in the biblical world or in the ancient Mediterranean world more broadly, not every prophet was socially marginal. That's a misconception. That's a kind of caricature that's not really correct. But liminal in some way, right? And we can also think about in maybe that trope of when one sense is cut off, other senses are heightened, and that the idea of that connection to otherworldly realities as a kind of sense, right? That without the distraction of seeing the apparent world around us, a prophet could see something more real. But the other connection would be, to think about the prophet as the seer of hidden realities. And that hiddenness could be what is hidden could be the future. It could be the character of what is around us in the present moment. And this is something, as you know, John, I also wrote about with respect to apocalyptic literature, right? That is pulling back the veil to show us
Uh-huh.
the actual character of things that on the surface might look polished and glamorous, and beneath the surface turn out to be kind of, what we might call demonic, or on the surface might look all powerful, but beneath the surface we see the vulnerabilities, whatever it may be. And so I think partly that it's that shared, whether we think of it as a trope or um, or something more kind of fundamental, but the ability to see past.
Uh-huh.
Uh, what things appear to be. And we see you mentioned earlier the story of Balaam, and he is referred to as the one who falls down with his eyes uncovered. Um, that
Uh,
to fall down, and you mentioned earlier spirit possession. I look at that passage in relation to the experience of spirit possession, but it also, and spirit possession was also understood to be a kind of physical like characterized by a kind of physical infirmity, to be in the grips of a disease or this hand of God upon you that rendered you weak and physically unable, right? And in the human disability, sometimes in biblical literature is showcased divine ability.
Oh.
Um, and sometimes the prophet then can become that conduit when they are relying less on their own ability and more on what God wishes to channel through them. So that's that's a factor in terms of looking more broadly at the parallels across traditions in the ancient world. One thing I will mention is that it the biblical literature I mentioned before, we have these books, these prophetic books, right? We've got the big three: Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. We've got the book of the 12, and depending on which canonical uh arrangement of books, we could add some other books to that list. But those particular ones, for the most part, are what many have referred to as writing prophets. Prophets as writers of books, or books that purport to be the writings of a prophet, and that's actually unusual. That's not the thing that we see in other cultures. And so focusing on the stories about prophets is actually where we will see the most commonality with prophets in other cultures.
Is that a little preview of what's coming next?
Well, what's coming next, we will be focusing on prophetic actions and interactions, embodied
Ah,
forms of prophecy. So Miriam dancing, I've mentioned a bunch of times, prophets healing people, those incredible prophetic street theater performances of the symbolic actions, um, and more. So that's coming next.
well, I can't wait. I know that you mentioned a few times in here that this is, I think, a planned trilogy. Is that right?
It is a
Okay.
trilogy. Yes. So
Wow.
book 2, embodied prophecy. Book 3 will go to embodied reception of biblical
Mm,
prophecy, and we're going to take it all the way down to the present day.
yeah. My that's wonderful. I just can't wait. My students, I think, are tired of the fact that I went to Duke because we spent the last month on history of interpretation, basically,
Love it.
after going through all the synoptic pieces. And just today, I was like, fourfold method. How would a medieval monk look at this passion narrative? And they were like, I don't know. It's a metaphor. So, anyway, yeah, I can't wait for both of those. But I have a do you have enough time for me to ask you a few really short questions that are just kind of like the questions we ask everyone?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. The first one is, who do you think that we should interview next?
Oh, who should you interview next? Give me more information about the
Mm,
kinds of topics and
oh,
people.
we're pretty open. What if you somebody who's doing something cool in biblical studies, or somebody maybe in theology or philosophy that you just thought, wait, I guess we're sort of just we're pretty open. It doesn't have to be super Benedictine,
I
but
Okay, I think you should talk to Nathan Mastinak.
okay.
He he is writing about the materiality. I mean, you would still be on prophetic literature, so that's what's on my mind a lot, but he's writing about the materiality of the prophetic scrolls and how
Oh,
that
cool.
how that changes everything for how we think about these biblical books. Um,
Awesome.
I think his work is really interesting, and I believe he will be joining the faculty at Notre Dame.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. What is a piece of media that you've experienced lately? A song, a movie, a TV show, or something that you would recommend to people generally? Our last person was Robert de la Naval, who's going to BC next year, or BU? No, BC. And he recommended White Lotus. So sky's the limit.
Okay, a piece of media. I mean, okay, I actually kind of want to go like super Benedictine here and just recommend to everyone the St. John's Bible. Prop-
Oh, yeah.
But
Oh my gosh, and you guys have the great edition at Duke. You have the really cool Heritage edition.
heritage. Yeah.
I'm so jealous. We could never afford it.
It's so beautiful. It's incredible. But folks
Um,
can maybe get to see visit Collegeville, see the original, but also you can see online.
yeah,
Donald
J
Trump's work is just incredible.
absolutely. Well, we did, as you might imagine, history of interpretation. We did a whole day on the same, like the beginnings of each gospel and talking about those really cool. And it just so happened that Ellen wrote the article for the alumni magazine at the same time about the same sort of thing. I was like, see, guys, I'm not crazy. Um, Okay. Well, I think that pretty much wraps everything up, and I appreciate you spending so much time with me. And I do just want to say, you probably don't remember, but I was like, what? Because why would you? Was really into animals back then, and this whole time I was like, what's up with those donkeys and those lions and those? There's a lot going on here, animal wise, guys. Those animals have bodies too, and you bring that up a lot in the book, and I was really grateful for that. So,
Yeah.
um,
We want to not just pay attention to human bodies. That's, it's a great like focal point, but lots of other bodies.
absolutely, and angelic bodies and all the rest. Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation. I'm really grateful.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your semester, your non-semester, yay!
Hey,
And I
hey.
can't wait to read the next book. Can't wait.
All right. Thank you so much, John. It's so great to see you and talk to you.
Yep, absolutely.
The Benedictine Thought and Action podcast is produced by John Badley, Jason Heron. The guys get a huge assist from student worker Arlo River, who let us know that he wasn't coming because, quote, he's not always going to be here, so we need to get used to him not being around. We're edited by the Ghost of Christmas Future. All facts are verified by a large language model who always says that we did an amazing job. The show is engineered by Gertrude of Elfta because she really has impeccable taste. Our music was still disappointingly composed by John and Jason. Our patron saint for this episode is Isaiah, the prophet, whose lyrics and coal-marked lips gave us the courage to finish editing, and the voice you're hearing was crafted using AI and a glued-together vinyl, Richard Loftus reading Martin Luther's 99 Theses over and over for hours.